Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Weber, and we're going to go over the history of sport. So, what is sport? Sport is an activity involving physical exertion and skill that is governed by a set of rules or customs and often undertaken competitively against others. Uh, Sport seems to involve basic human skills being developed and exercised for the necessity of survival. For example, archery for hunting, self-defense for war, sailing for travel and survival. So things that individuals did in wartime, such as fighting, became a sport. Archery as in target practice, and sailing, and which was used for travel and survival. These were all things that were viewed as sport in the ancient times. So ancient skills become sports. So gladiators in Rome fought and killed for the enjoyment of an audience rather than to protect the empire. So instead of fighting people because of war, you're actually fighting people because of sport. And what I mean by sport is that there's going to be rules that govern what dictate happens in the arena. And so maybe it's a tiger involved, or maybe there's a prisoner who is locked up in chains, and they get certain types of tools to use as they defend themselves. And so those would be some of the rules in those ancient games. So yachting is the travel across water for enjoyment or competition rather than for transport or commerce. So the reason why people created boats was to get from one side of the river to the other. And as time went on, this became a competitive natured race. Who could get there the quickest? And so you were awarded on, your captainship and your ability to sail and use the wind, and that was considered a skill. Running is done on a course for a fixed length of time or distance rather than simply to deliver messages. So you have people who ran to deliver messages. People would warn cities or towns on foot or on horse, and so the quicker the better, obviously. And this became something as the track and field event. Stone Age drawings were discovered in the Libyan desert, depicting, among other activities, swimming and archery. Okay, so you would go into deserts or caves, and you would see these drawings in ancient times where you would see a horse and some people, and it would show what looks to be archery or swimming and activities that involved competition. Captain Cook visited the Hawaiian Islands in 1778, reported on the native people surfing. So in 1778, the first people were seen surfing in Hawaii. The Native Americans engaged in games and sports before the coming of Europeans, such as lacrosse, type ball games, running, and other athletic activities. So the Native Americans were the first to play lacrosse, and that was seen first by the colonists and voyagers from the west, or from the east. The ancient Mayan and Aztec civilizations played serious ball games. The courts used at the time are still used today. You can watch these videos, such as this Mayan game here. Okay, this is a Mayan ball game in Mexico. And it looks like they're still performing these games. So they roll the ball in, and they can only hit it with their hip. So this is a interesting game, and I think the point of it is to try to get the ball all the way to the other side to make a goal or a point. Same thing here, just a little bit different. They're trying to get the ball looks like through the circle. So those would be some examples of some ancient games still used today. Organization. Sport has been increasingly organized and regulated from the time of the ancient Olympics up to the present century. Activities necessary for food and survival became regulated activities done for pleasure or competition on an increasing scale, e.g. hunting, fishing, and horticulture. So ancient China, artifacts and structures suggest that Chinese engaged in activities which meet our definition of sport as early as 4,000 years or BC. Origin and development of China's sports seem to have been related to the production, work, war, and entertainment of the time. Okay, games like soccer were introduced, and females played soccer until they were deemed to be too skilled, and then that's when the whole foot wrapping began. Ancient China, gymnastics appears to have been a popular sport in China's past. It remains so today as the skill of Chinese acrobats is internationally recognized. And why are they excellent in acrobatic endeavors? Why do you think? Ancient Egypt, monuments to the pharaohs indicate that a range of sports were well developed thousands of years ago, including swimming and fishing. The importance of the Nile in the life of Egypt was part of their culture. And so many of the activities that happened as far as fishing and swimming obviously happened in the Nile, and it was a place where people valued the most. Ancient Egypt, other sports included javelin, throwing, high jump, and wrestling. These things occurred during the Pharaoh times, and this obviously was for the Egyptian pharaohs and the leaders at the time. Ancient Greece, wrestling, running, boxing, javelin, discus throwing, and chariot racing were prevalent. This suggests that the military culture of Greece was an influence on the development of its sports. So as you notice that many of the sports come from military culture. Ancient Greece, the Olympic Games began around 776 BC in ancient Greece. Games were held not simply as a sporting event, but as a celebration of individual excellence, cultural and artistic variety, and how a showplace for architectural and sculptural innovation. Ancient Olympic events on day one, the athletes as well as the judges took an oath to respect the rules. That was always first and foremost, and the contests for trumpet players and heralds followed this ceremony. Ancient Olympics events on day two, the equestrian events took place in the hippodrome, what it's called, and the most popular event was the four-horse chariot with quadriga. There were also chariot races for young horses and a mounted horse race. So on the second day, that's when you saw the horses, the chariots, and many of these horses worked together to pull one or two people. Ancient Olympic events on day two, the pentathlon took place in the stadium in the afternoon. It consisted of 5 events: discus, long jump, javelin, running, and wrestling. So these are all the events on day two. On day three, this was considered to be the culminating point of the games. A great sacrifice took place. 100 cows were killed in honor of Zeus and other divinities. So at that time, sacrifice was looked at as a honorable thing because sacrifice indicated that you were, doing something now in preparation for something later. So the point of a sacrifice was always to get something as far as what the outcomes might be in the future. Ancient Olympic events on day 4, the different races took place in the stadium, and spectators sat on the surrounding slopes and were very close to the action. Ancient Olympics events on day 4, the afternoon was dedicated to combat sports. So you had pugilism, which is boxing, wrestling, and pancratin. So pankration is your MMA of the modern era. So MMA is actually a form of pankration, which was an ancient Olympic event on day 4. On day 5, this day was reserved for honoring victorious athletes. So on day 5, you get your honors and your medals. Brutal ancient sports. So this would be a video you can watch in Google pankration on YouTube. So modern history of sport. The Industrial Revolution and emerging middle class brought increased leisure, which allowed increase in spectator sports, less elitism in sports, and greater accessibility. So not just the really poor or really rich were involved in sports. It was more of a inclusive. Industrial Revolution, so the early years, limited time and limited space. The workday was typically too long, so you didn't have a lot of sport. There was few parks in cities. Rural communities had more game and sport participation. Urban working classes, mainly spectators of horse racing, boxing, wrestling, boat races, were the sports of the time, and emphasis on calisthenics, gymnastics, and outdoor exercise was also introduced. In the 1900s, club establishments, mainly upper class, led to open competitions. So the YMCA was created in 1844, and this had a big influence on identifying exercise and sports as Christian. Middle and working class participation, beginning of amateur professionalism distinction, and growing emphasis on seriousness of sports. So this included economic productivity, national loyalty, and character development. In the 20th century, period of dramatic sport growth. So you had corporate sport and health push. More money was spent on sports equipment by all schools. Improved equipment, social involvement, and part of educational system. So systems started to introduce sports and teach sports into the curriculum. So since the 1920s, sports and society links were established. Spectator sports involving intercollegiate and professional began. Competition, winning, record setting, coaching a specialized technical profession, and control passed to coaches, managers, and administrative staff. Sports in the 1920s look much like today's sports, but no TV. Popular culture influence. Sports over the last 100 years has affected modern popular culture and has often reflected changing social attitudes and standards. Fashions now often reflect sport clothing, partly because of the money injected into sports by fashion houses, and partly because of our desire to emulate our heroes and heroines. So politics, this can include athletes using their fame to run for office seekers using athletics to boost their candidacy, boycotts to boost causes, most famously the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. There is, however, a downside to the use of sports in politics. This ranges from terrorists using the sports to gain exposure for their cause. John Ronan, a U.S. congressman in 2010 to present. I don't think he is anymore, but he was an NFL offensive tackle who spent most of his career with the Philadelphia Eagles. He was elected to 1 Pro Bowl and played in 1 Super Bowl. His political career, Ronan is about to finish his first year as a U.S. representative from New Jersey's 3rd District. So he was an athlete and he turned into a congressman. He's probably still not a congressman, but you also had Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California from 2003 to 2011. With an athletic career in bodybuilding, he won the Mr. Universe and Mr. Olympia. And he was a moderate conservative and ended up winning the infamous 2003 recall election by over 1 million votes. He ended up winning another term in 2006. So nowadays you have athletes who make a lot of money, and you have athletes who have changed history, and you have athletes who run very fast, and you have scholarship opportunities. So the growth of sports has also made possible the education of many young people who would otherwise never have had that opportunity. For many of those students, sports made going to college possible, particularly through the use of college scholarships, which have increased in size and number as sports created bigger revenues for schools. Big business. Sports and business have become forever linked, even in college, which is supposedly played by amateurs and not professionals. From sports on television to sponsorships to naming rights on stadiums, the history of business of sports reveals that business tied itself to sports more and more in the later half of the 20th century, really ramping up in the 1970s and onward. So amateur, here's some salaries of some coaches. You have Alabama here, Nick Saban making almost $7 million a year. Michigan State making almost $5 million, and then you have all the way here in South Carolina at $4 million. So coaches can make a lot of money, and this was in 2014, so I'm sure they're making way more than that now. All right, so that is an overview of the history of sports, and I hope you enjoyed it. See y'all later.